difference between science fiction and fantasy? I am so glad you asked. Science fiction is where the magic is technology. Fantasy is where the technology is magic. Science fiction is either set in or inspired by a hypothetical future. It takes place in a reality where humanity has perfected space travel, colonized other planets, etc. Fantasy is either set in or based on a hypothetical past. So you have more historical, mythological, or folklore-inspired settings. You can have a science fiction story with fantasy elements, which confuses a lot of people. It is strongly discouraged for fantasy authors to integrate science fiction elements because fantasy readers in general are much less tolerant of science fiction elements than vice versa. So science fiction readers are generally cool with fantasy elements like telepathy or psychics, for example. But fantasy readers are not nearly as cool with computers or spaceships in their castles. Fantasy books should feel like folklore or history. Now, people always try to argue this by pulling out a science fiction book with fantasy elements. The Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson is an example of a science fiction book that has a lot of heavy fantasy elements. However, it is a book with spaceships and interplanetary travel and research stations. It has a lot of fantasy elements, but it is still sci-fi. The Time Quintet by Madeleine L'Engle is another example where there are a lot of heavy fantasy elements, but in the end, everything is attributed to quantum physics and science. Now, you can parse this out further with hard sci-fi like The Expanse versus soft sci-fi like everything in the Star Wars universe. There is also high fantasy, such as the Stormlight Archive, versus low fantasy, such as A Song of Ice and Fire, and many other subgenre distinctions we won't cover here. You also have subgenres such as technological thrillers or urban fantasy, which are set in the modern day with modern people, but integrate sci-fi and or fantasy elements. But again, I'm not discussing any subgenres in this video. If a book uses scientific words, appeals firstly to science nerds, and is inspired by a hypothetical future, it is science fiction. If a book uses old-timey words and appeals first to history/mythology/folklore nerds and is inspired by the past, it is fantasy.